Welcome to Lawo's VSM video training series on panel building. In this video, we're going to look at creating panel groups, adding buttons to panels, and button labeling. Please note that you'll need the VSM panel application installed on your computer to do this. In the previous video, we talked about panel IDs. With VSM panel running, we'll set the assignment to panel ID number 2. And we'll see in real time how the changes we make to our panel are reflected in an actual software panel. In VSM panel, one handy feature is called the Fit to Window option, and when we click it, the panel automatically scales to the size of the window frame. You'll find this is very useful when dealing with multiple panels on the screen at the same time. If you do not select Fit to Window, the panel size in the frame will be its native actual size. So let's move this aside into the lower corner of the screen. If you have a secondary monitor, it's often preferable to run VSM panel on that separate monitor. Here is our panel editor, and later we'll be using the master matrix, but for now let's slide it off to the side to get it out of the way. This panel list is no longer needed, so we'll close that. You'll see pretty soon that Windows management within VSM is always important, because as more windows increase, the real estate on your screen becomes more precious. We're making a little more room right now because we're about to also open the Properties window. Because the toolbar menu is always on top, you want it off to the side because sometimes it'll pop up in front of you and get in the way, so just keep it off to the side of the screen. What you see in the panel editor window is the default layout after originally being created. It doesn't have any pages yet and opens in a default layout tab. This is where you'll define the basic look and feel of your panel. Are you going to have sources in the top row and destinations or targets in the bottom row? Or might you have sources on the left side and targets or destinations on the right side? And also, where might your navigation buttons go? And possibly rotary encoders if your hardware panel is so equipped. It's important to design and build your layout properly from the beginning after having a full understanding of what your hardware panel is supposed to be built like. Generally, we design these panels with sources on the left and destinations or targets on the right. In a big facility, you'll have far more sources and destinations than can be displayed on one 51-button panel, which is why we then build other pages and rely heavily on navigation features. So looking at this panel, again, it's got 3 rows of 17 buttons each. We're going to split this up into 3 separate pieces, or regions, and create 3 groups on this panel. We'll start with the Group button from the toolbar menu. This tool is called Define Virtual Pages. You'll notice it's the red-colored tool. And with this tool, we'll make 3 groups on this panel. By default, this group becomes group number 1, and you'll notice the number 1 in a little blue box in each of the button regions. Now let's define group 2 and group 3. Each time clicking on the Define Virtual Page tool. And it's okay if the boxes that you draw out overlap each other. However, any button you do not fully include will not be part of a group, so be sure to fully include each of the buttons you wish to assign to that group. We'll leave these 3 buttons on the right outside of any group for future use. Notice, for example, if we take button number 15 right here and slowly edge it out to the right side, it eventually leaves the group number 3 region and no longer is associated with group 3. You'll notice that both the blue box and red boxes disappear from the button. That means it's no longer assigned to a group. We're moving this by simply left-clicking and releasing on the button, and then using the left or right, up or down arrows on your keyboard to move the button. Something to remember is, of course, we're building for a hardware panel, so we can't really move the button. But in this case, moving the button outside of the group can have other uses later. Now notice over here, the blue box. You would use this if you wanted to create 2 entirely independent panels on the same panel. Let's give an example of why you would want to do this. Perhaps you have mounted in a rack 3 video monitors, and a hardware button panel immediately below. You could divide the panel up into 3 sub-pages, and each one would control sources for each of the 3 monitors, without having any impact on the other monitors. So back to building our panel, let's first create our first page. We'll call this page 1, otherwise known as the idle page, or the main page. You can think of it as sort of a home page or home screen where you will keep coming back to for your base navigation. Now let's look into our toolbar for a couple of different navigation buttons. Firstly, this red arrow here is what's called the escape button. This is your get out of jail button or your back to home page button. It's a good idea to have this button available on many of your pages. Let's put this onto group 2. We'll do that by left-clicking on the red tool and then left-clicking on the button on the panel where we wish to place it. Notice when we do, the Properties window comes up immediately. The Properties window shows up every time you click on a button, so it's really important to keep it out of the way but easy to access when you need it. Something interesting about the Properties window is that as we've closed it, we clicked through it and placed another escape button on our panel, which we didn't really want to do. Therefore, a good reason to move the Properties window out of the way. Another example, we'll click on the generic button and place a button on the panel, and up comes the Properties window. This is something that we'd like to get out of the way, so we'll just click and drag that up a little higher onto the screen, and then we can pin it so it doesn't hop around the screen on us and it stays in one place. Now notice that we've added a red button, a generic button, into the upper right corner of our panel, but we don't really want it there. So now let's click on this tool. This is the blank button. Left click on this, and then left click on the button you would like to remove from the panel. Notice that when adding buttons onto the panel, it's not drag and drop. What you do is you change the tool type on your mouse by selecting the tool, and then every button you click on will add that new tool type, or whatever behavior is associated to that tool. You can click on the gray area outside of the actual buttons if you want to remove the tool from your mouse. Now let's use the generic tool and add some generic buttons onto our panel. It's very simple. Again, left click on a generic tool and then left click on the buttons where you want to place them. Noticing, of course, that our Properties window is coming up. Also notice on the mouse a small letter G. Once we click on the gray area outside of the button panel, the G goes away from the mouse and the Properties window goes away. Once again, clicking in the gray area disassociates any tool from your mouse. Always a good idea if you get a little bit lost and didn't know exactly what tool you've got at the time. So to delete these generic buttons we don't want, we again select the tool used for deleting called the blank button. Please note that you are unable to delete a button by Control X or by right-clicking and selecting a menu option. You must use the blank tool to delete the buttons. Notice again that we have now the blank button associated with our mouse tip. We could click in the gray area to remove that, but another way to do that is to simply hit the Escape key on our keyboard. So now what we'd like to do is split up our panel into 3 regions. The middle section will always be visible, the left section will be dedicated to navigation and sources, and the right section will be dedicated to navigation and targets. Let's add 3 generic buttons, one to each region. The Sources region, the Navigation region, and the Destination or Targets region. Now let's add some names to these new generic buttons. We do that by right-clicking and edit the bitmap. And you'll see as we change the name on this button, it actually appears in real time on the VSM panel on the lower part of the screen. And then we just type in the description that we want. You'll notice throughout the videos that we say target and destination in a rather iterative fashion. But we like the word target because it fits on a button a lot better than the word destination. Notice that we can change the colors of these buttons. There's normal color and active color. Normal color is the color of the button when it's not being used, and active color is the color when it's active. Through these drop-down menus, you can customize the font color and the button background. These 2 options on the top row are what the button will look like on a soft panel. The next 2 options are what it will look like on a hardware panel, and the third row of options are what it would look like on a low-cost button panel, which you probably won't encounter in your configs. On the right side of the Properties window, the Style drop-down and the various checkboxes below are all reserved for VSM panel look and feel and behavior of the buttons. One example is that we can create a slider out of a button, but in a hardware panel environment, there's no way to actually have a slider, so you'll see the button on the VSM panel window doesn't change. That's again because VSM knows that this is actually a hardware panel, not a VSM panel. So let's refine the color of our buttons to properly match the VSM workflow. Sources are generally purple in color, and we'll change that here in the Properties window. And targets are generally green in color, and we'll change that in the Properties window. Notice again they change in real time in the VSM panel application. Notice here for our little demo, we have room for 20 sources and 20 destinations on one panel. In the real world, facilities would be much larger and require multiple pages. Especially in larger facilities, the signal path families will be crucial in building properly structured pages and panels. Now what we're going to do is add navigation buttons that are associated with the signal path families. As you start to see the panel development evolve, you'll see how that makes sense. For now, let's take the generic tool and click on all the button locations where we will want navigation buttons. Notice that as we add these generic buttons, the button in the panel is allocated to the generic tool, but it won't actually show up as an active button on the VSM panel until you edit the bitmap. A button space that you've clicked on with the generic tool is not an empty button. Notice as we are adding these generic buttons into the target section, we've clicked off of one of the buttons into some of the gray area. Now we've lost the generic tool type. So we have to go back to the tools and reattach the generic functionality to our mouse. So all of these buttons we've just added will be used for navigation buttons now. Let's create some navigation pages for our different sources, and logically we'll structure them by the signal path family. Our signal path families for sources include cameras, CCUs, frame syncs, servers, and patches. So now let's add names to our navigation buttons that reflect the signal path families. Camera, CCU, frame sync, server, and patch. These navigation buttons will then link to specific pages associated to these signal path family sources.